We are on a quest to get the highest ranks in every Resident Evil game we possibly can, without running. In December last year, we did Resident Evil 4 Remake, which ended in failure, so today we were going to be attempting Now, Resident Evil 3 Remake certainly was one of the remakes of all time. What are those? And whilst it gets its fair share of hate, the game's hardest difficulty, quite frankly, deserves all of the hate that it gets. If Taco Bell-induced diarrhea was a difficulty, it would be Inferno. Playing this difficulty at times felt like Capcom were trying to put our spice limit to the test. But setting my personal feelings to one side, the requirement for getting an S rank on this difficulty dictated that we would need to beat the game in only 2 hours. As usual, Inferno ships with no autosave feature either, but in return, it only gives us 5 typewriter saves for the entirety of the game. For the rules, no shop weapons or special items like coins or Chris Redfield's diary would be allowed, and in case it wasn't already obvious, just like when enjoying a urine-infused swim at the local pool, there was no running allowed. Resident Evil 3 Remake does, however, have an interesting mechanic that's unique to the Resident Evil 3 series: dodging. Now, dodging would be permitted for this challenge as it's not technically running, but it can only be used to try and evade enemy attacks. Speedrunners often use dodging as a means of gaining additional movement when injured or to push through doors, but this is not allowed. Apart from that, the only other rule is to just have a good time. September 28th. It all began as an ordinary day in Raccoon City, a city controlled behind the scenes by the sinister and mysterious organization known as the Institute. Jill, a member of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, had been the only one to stand up to their questionable practices, whistleblowing on their activities in the city and their experimentation on humans with something called the Forced Evolutionary Virus. Her efforts to do the right thing were met with expulsion from the Institute and an unrelenting smear campaign against her name. But today, Jill's forewarnings had come true. The Institute's 2 out of 5 health and safety rating had led to the outbreak of the evolutionary virus. Once it hit the populace of Raccoon City, it mutated rapidly, infecting the entire population in a matter of days. Whilst the United States government and the Institute had initially worked on a vaccine to tackle the outbreak, the White House had decided that the easiest, most cost-effective option would be to just nuke Raccoon City and start again. With nuclear annihilation now imminent, Jill and the city were instructed to head to their nearest vault, which for us was at the Spencer Mansion up in the Arklay Mountains. I'm sure that place will be safe and secure. Just as we were about to leave to begin our long walk to the vault, we get a knock at the door. The biologically impossible size of this figure that had arrived, spamming the word stars like a GIMP version of Hodor, meant only one thing. The Institute had been successful in bonding the forced evolutionary virus to a host, and that host had been sent to silence Jill. Despite the super mutants' attempts to fold our head up our own arsehole, we still couldn't break away from the rules. Vault-Tech's SOP stated that we needed to make our way to the vault in a calm, orderly fashion, and without panicking. So that's exactly what we were going to do. No running, no panicking, just a nice, calm walk. After our apartment block comes crashing down on the super mutant assassin, we temporarily escape his grasp and meet up with Chicken Nugget Vickers, where we're immediately thrown into the first speed bump of the run. A mere 2 minutes into the challenge, and this speed bump turned out to be more like driving over a slab of concrete. The chem-addicted population of Raccoon City had begun pouring over these fences, searching mindlessly for their next fix, but had inadvertently blocked our path through to Brad and the diner. And coming out of the cutscene, before we knew it, we were instantly tackled to the ground, and we were having the back of our necks kissed without our consent by one of these feral ghouls. Now, this chem-aggravated murder was a problem. Not only was our dodge ability currently unavailable, we're also in the injured animation, so we're extra slow and can be game overed in one hit. And that's also not to mention that these 4 zombies have got the need for speed. So back we went to the apartment to repeat all of this again, only to die again, and again, and again, and again. And 11 deaths later, we were as close to the diner as we were 45 minutes ago. Most of the time we instantaneously got our cheeks clapped, making this repeat of Jill's flat segment absolute torture. But you know me well enough by now. I wasn't going to throw in the towel just because this walking pickled egg said so. Weird problems that were almost exclusively brought on by myself required weird solutions. Sitting there watching these troglodytes move, observing their movements, I'd noticed something interesting. The zombies' movements are not the same every time we enter this area. They stumble and move erratically depending on our positioning and how much chem they've consumed. If their movement was RNG, that meant that there was a chance that we could make this by only walking. Albeit it was an absolutely microscopic one at that, but it was a chance nonetheless. So zombies 1 and 2 are our biggest problem here. They move inwards and outwards respectively, and despite zombie 1's aggro range being the same size as Jeff Bezos' forehead, before he ripped us apart, we could for a split second see the Moses-like gap that we needed. Admittedly, for this to work, we needed Zombie 1 to stumble forwards and away from us, and for both zombies to not aggro, and whilst I had no proof that this could work, I had no doubts either. And after 9 more attempts of doing some personal self-care in Jill's bathroom, it happened. Zombie 1's rotting ankles collapsed in on themselves under the weight of its type 2 diabetes, and Zombie 2 had got so bored that he'd forgotten what he was supposed to be doing here, and like Jesus Christ walking on water, we had done what had seemingly been the impossible. Making it into the diner to enjoy a nice cold Nuka-Cola and wait for all this to blow over. But really, the hard truth was that after spending nearly 2 hours trying to get through the first 2 minutes of the game, nobody was a winner here. As the undead broke into the diner and devoured chicken heart Vickers like KFC, the prospect of dying and having to repeat all of this bullshit troubled me deeply. But we had now got access to a pistol and the game-changing dodge ability, making the trip to the subway station that much easier. After our nemesis from the apartment block returns, we take a shortcut off the 7th floor of the car park, where Carlos arrives to save the day by launching a fat man danger close directly into this guy's face.
Oh my god!
Once in the station, Carlos's commander, Mikhail Maxon, asks us for our help in restoring power to the subway station so we can begin evacuating civilians up to the Arclay Vault. We agree to help, but as we prepared to head out into the streets of Raccoon City, you might have expected me to save here to preserve the pain that we'd just been through. Well, the truth of the matter is that we can't save. At least not now. We have only 5 saves to work with for the entirety of the game, but in reality, we only had the illusion of choice here. Realistically, 4 out of the 5 saves were already reserved for later in the game to combat some of the hardest segments and fights that we'd come up against. If there are any mathematicians out there, you'll know that leaves us 1 save left at our disposal, which meant that we'd need to wait for the most strategically optimal place to use it. So we passed the first typewriter with tears in our eyes and headed out into the apocalyptic streets of Raccoon City, with everything on the line. But fear not, my sweet viewers, I wouldn't be recommending this course of action if I wasn't 100% confident in my abilities. It's just a shame that my abilities were on par with my 90-year-old arthritis-riddled grandmother. So with every skill point we had funneled into luck, we begin the slog through Raccoon City. A mixture of chem addiction and lockdown had driven everyone here beyond insane. The streets were looted, every piece of toilet roll in a 5-mile radius had been stolen, and somehow, literally everything was on fire. But at least the donut shop was still open. The early gift of the Magnum on Inferno shows us why it's such a god-tier weapon for this challenge as we collateral our way through the opening obstacles before grabbing the first jewelry box from the pharmacy and the hose from the subway office.
You look lonely. I can fix that.
We take the route back up the fire escape to avoid the gang of zombies congregating outside of the donut shop, and after the fire is put out, Nikolai shows us the importance of knowing basic first aid.
No, wait, please!
We put down dog meat en route through to the control room where we lure these 2 zombies back around this bank to get a clearer route up these stairs and to the start of the substation maze. After graphically receiving some non-consensual parasites down our throat, the Mirelurks had apparently infested this area, and despite their overwhelming numbers, walking through this area wasn't as taxing as you might think. Each area had a pretty predictable number of Mirelurks that spawned in. A couple of shots would cause them to fall off the ceiling or spontaneously combust, and whilst we certainly had to keep our wits about us to avoid being dragged inside this gaping orifice, by being extra careful and dutiful, powering on the 4 substation breakers and walking our way out of there without any issue quickly became a reality. After firebombing their home, we could begin the trip back to the subway control station to program a route for Mikhail's train. However, now comes our biggest test so far. Mere moments before we'd made it to the first save point I'd marked out for us, this walking UTI had again arrived to suplex us into the nearest bin. But despite our life hanging in the balance, as always, we had a plan. By pressing aim as soon as you reach this pixel, which is the Nemesis spawn trigger, you can cancel Jill's usual stagger. This means you can immediately throw a grenade at Nemesis without having to dodge his initial haymaker. 1 handgun bullet puts him on the floor, and 5 more in a magnum shot maximizes our damage output whilst he's subdued. one more magnum shot and 6 more from the handgun once he gets up forces him to relinquish his little case of delights and stuns him long enough for us to walk our way to safety and to the first save point. And we could finally breathe. Our progress was secure, but unfortunately, it only gets tougher from here on out. The reason for using our only unallocated save here is that the walk to the train station control room is sketchy as fuck. Nemesis was not only trying to exceed our recommended daily dosage of fisting, but we were going to be forced to just continue to take it. We didn't have anywhere near the kind of ammunition needed to beat Nemesis back another 3 or 4 times, so the only way we were making it through here would be by walking. In light of this, we reallocated all of our skill points from luck into agility and began hitting consecutive dodges down towards the control room. Despite requiring perfect timing, these dodges not only kept us safe from damage, but they provide an excellent way of gaining additional distance away from Nemesis and his high-speed meat tenderizers. Dodge after dodge, and we eventually make it down to the donut shop where we can hit the electrical unit next to us to temporarily stun Nemesis in place. If we electrocuted Nemesis's nipples at the perfect time, he should remain here until we reach the control room. But I did not time it perfectly. So instead, Nemesis comes flying over us, forcing us to make an immensely tense and dodge-heavy entry into the control room instead. Once safely inside, we can correctly reroute Mikhail's train and grab the shotgun from the office, ready to make our return trip. Outside the donut shop, we find Nemesis spreading his dirty little seed around the place, and this time, defeating him was the only option we had. The way back to the station is absolutely packed with atomites, all looking to spread the good word of the atom gospel. With that in mind, we could do without a 7-foot super mutant breathing down our neck. By timing our retreat up through town perfectly, we defeat Nemesis just outside the pharmacy, allowing us to pick up a first aid spray and large resource from inside before continuing our tense walk through the masses congregating outside the train station, arriving back at the shutters just as Nemesis comes flying through the air like Randy Orton. As we'd managed to pick up 2 of the free jewelry boxes on our travels, we could use them to win a grenade and shotgun stock out of the clock tower prize machine before we head downstairs to meet up with Luis. Nemesis, like some massive dingleberry, just would not let go of us, meaning that the dodge keybind sadly continues to get no respite. Upon finishing the cutscene, we have literally 30 frames to turn around and face Nemesis and begin the dodge cycle all over again. As always, perfection is required, but isn't always guaranteed. The claustrophobic nature of this corridor and Nemesis spamming X like your cheating younger brother playing Tekken gives us almost no flexibility to miss. Particularly on the stairs, which hinder our already slow movement speeds. As with the previous challenge, quitting to the main menu and not selecting continue meant that we can reset the in-game timer to the time at our previous typewriter save, and whilst having to repeat half of downtown again felt like an undeserved slap in the face with a baguette full of dog shit, we make it back to Redstone Station fairly quickly. Despite immediately getting our head slammed into some concrete, the grade 3 concussion seemed to have no impact on our agility. After one more perfect dodge up the stairs, we get in range of the electrical outlet, which stuns Nemesis just long enough for us to reach the red barrels, blowing him up and giving us enough time to open the vent to the sewers. With a mysteriously familiar voice in our head calling us we make a quick pep talk to ourselves in the mirror, and 30 minutes later, we make it back. And with a lot less unalive bombing, we closed out downtown Raccoon City with 1 hour and 34 minutes remaining on the timer. There isn't anything particularly exciting about the sewers. We find a number of Gulper variants who had been subsisting off the projectile diarrhea down here. But apart from grabbing the grenade launcher and the door battery, we tidy up the area pretty quickly before our stalker arrives to kindly give us a hand, or in this case a head, up to the construction site. His new toy was pretty hot. And at one point, I thought we might be too slow to outwalk the fire rapidly engulfing this place. But with nothing more than mild smoke inhalation, we make it to the roof to begin the boss battle with Backpack Flamer Nemesis.
If you're not doing something that you love to do, find something that you love to do.
Before we start fighting, we collect as many of the items in the arena as we could. Phase 1 is a lot easier to maneuver around here than Phase 2, which is full-blown AIDS. Once we'd hoovered everything up, it doesn't take long for us to wrap up Stage 2, whose only major source of anxiety was the insta-kill attack combos that came with this move. With Nemesis now cooking nicely at 4,000 degrees, we head down to Kendo's, where we grab a few supplies on the way over and sacrifice a few seconds to take the long route around to his store to avoid as many of these enemies as possible. Kendo advises that Vegas had been bleeding him dry. He'd been tossing caps at 100 different problems, while Caesar bides his time and lets us wear ourselves out. We shouldn't be perched here up at the dam. We ought to be crossing the Colorado and sticking a boot up Caesar's arse.
What's going on with you? What are you talking about? You sound insane.
Anyways, we pillage the rest of his shop and enact the second save of the run, and you'll find out why in just a moment. With Nemesis unboxing his new Fat Man with the same excitement as a kid opening a Sega Mega Drive at Christmas, this segment presented a number of potential health-related problems.
This is cancer. This is so much cancer that I can...
Nemesis and his rockets are all insta-kills, but by coming up with our own sandwalk here like we were Paul Atreides walking over the surface of Arrakis, we can consistently escape down the first alley. But even if we did make it, like some kind of weird zombie cock block, there are enemies strategically placed down the second alleyway to ensure maximum potential for a stroke was achieved. After a few attempts, we eventually found the perfect rhythm. Once around the first corner, a cross-field grenade launcher round over at this wall knocks the two zombies here off their feet, suppressing them temporarily so we could turn to restart our rocket launcher sandwall. And despite a bit of an awkward grab and hit from the two parasite zombies, we walk our way to the next cutscene. Which, weirdly enough, you can just walk straight ahead and watch on as Nemesis misses every single shot.
Primary target is identified.
Gentlemen, this is what we've been waiting for. Confirm at 2:18 and 27 seconds. The Nemesis program is now fully activated.
But now comes a slightly dubious section, the falling holy head of Owl's toy barn. Now let's just get this out of the way straight away. You categorically cannot walk back to safety. Trust me, I tried. So we'd reached a sort of impasse. I refused to run under any circumstances, and if we couldn't walk through here without becoming a sheet of phyllo pastry, we'd need to bend our no dodge mobility rule just once and very, very slightly. And to be honest, even with only dodges, making it out of this section was not a guarantee. Eventually, 3 painful resets later, turning around and instantly making 4 immediate consecutive forward dodges and a perfectly timed sideways dodge, we tuck ourselves in just in time to avoid being flattened by the plastic head. Despite our mini victory here, we weren't out of the woods yet. Rocket Nemesis comes flying through the ring of the donut and we begin part 2 of performing the most intense moonwalk back towards Carlos and the petrol station, where Nemesis had a surprise waiting for him.
Oh.
With Nemesis forgetting to equip EOD in favour of extreme conditioning, we can arrive back at the subway ready to finally depart for the vault. As we left Carlos behind to collect more survivors for the next trip, we overhear Mikhail talking to Nikolai, where it's revealed that one of the Institute's scientists had successfully reverse-engineered the virus, creating the world's first forced evolutionary vaccine. But with the nukes fast approaching, the vaccine's historic work would be lost. With this news entering her ears, Jill couldn't stand by and do nothing. If there was even a remote chance that some slice of good could come from all of this, Jill would do everything she could to rescue it. Firstly, we'd make sure these civilians were safely deposited at the vault before we'd make our way back to Raccoon City to retrieve this vaccine. But before we could even finish our thought process, the plan was completely changed. Now, with just over an hour left on the clock, it was now time to hand the reins over to Carlos for his walking debut. Our adventure to the RPD was on the surface fairly straightforward, but with another boss fight on the horizon, my reluctance to save here meant that the atmosphere in the station remained quite tense.
Carlos, take a look at this.
Not to fear, little children. I will help.
One benefit of only walking was that lickers, the lethal tongue-wielding enemies that we'd all come to fear, were rendered into a vegetative state. Walking meant they had no idea we were in fact flipping them off millimeters away from their face. But whilst we get a win here, we are unfortunately still forced into defending ourselves from the hordes of police officers roaming the precinct.
Why? I just don't get it. I always catch you fuckers watching this sick shit. This is sickening.
Alongside a distinct lack of ammo and a pretty congested ending to the chapter, we do our best to collect as much ammo and grenades throughout the RPD as possible whilst retaining the most efficient pathing we could. By flashing everyone else after blowing up the shower and tanking a bite to the neck, we make it through to the STARS office by the skin of our neck that had just been torn out. Once in the STARS office, we receive a call from a doctor of the Institute, Brian Virgil, who reveals that he had developed a successful vaccine capable of reversing the impact of FEV on the population of Raccoon City. Despite this breakthrough, he claimed that the Institute, whilst publicly backing the vaccine's creation, had sent agents to bury his work, and him along with it. We told Virgil to sit tight and that we were on our way, and as we left for the hospital, something told me that this was going to present a much tougher challenge than the RPD. We rejoined Jill on what was basically a standard Monday on the London Underground and can thankfully initiate save number 3 of the run, ready to tackle Nemesis, whose FEV mutation had now changed its entire biological structure into that of a Deathclaw. I'd spent a ton of time practicing these fights prior to starting the challenge, and whilst there is always an element of complete unrelenting bullshit, avoiding this insta-kill attack was the only paramount objective. I found that we could increase our chances of survival by using the middle bush area, helping disrupt Nemesis' attacks in a similar way to our Verdugo strategy from the Berserker mod playthrough. Overall, the most worrying part of all of this was just how much ammo this guy was taking. Time was of the essence, but without any ammo, we'd be a sitting duck. The likely cause of this guy being such a tank was that hitting every perfect dodge known to man had probably maxed out our DA. Now, DA stands for difficulty adjustment and changes a number of factors of the game depending on how well we were doing. Meaning, if it was maxed out at rank 19 like I feared, it would make everything from here on out that much more difficult to defeat. Eventually though, we grind Nemesis down and the strategy pays dividends as we convert the Deathclaw into the texture of roast chicken before mopping up the rest of the remaining ammo around the arena. But before we could continue our pursuit of the vaccine, Nemesis fires an FEV-infected barb directly into our arm. This was gross, and despite pulling it out immediately, we could already feel the cold, death-like feeling of the FE virus coursing through our veins. And as the world around us started to fade to black, we wondered, did I leave the stove on? Hours later, whilst en route to find Dr. Virgil, Carlos finds our lobotomized corpse on the floor, and with no regard for his own safety, gives us a piggyback to the hospital. Usually dragging a patient with a violently contagious pathogen to a hospital would be a massive no-no, but I think in today's current climate, we'd probably be fine. As we set Jill down on the bed, her condition appeared to be worsening. With less than an hour left on the clock, Jill wasn't the only one whose time was running out. With Dr. Virgil's words ringing out in our ears, he was maybe Jill's only hope. But as we set out to find him, as suspected, the hospital presented a much more complex challenge than the RPD. Unsanitary equipment was littered everywhere, the food looked as though it was made inside a toilet, and there were people queuing out of the door. Which was just the usual NHS experience as far as us Brits were concerned, but after grabbing the nursing key from downstairs, another dark, evil rose from within the halls of the hospital. The hunters, whilst being graphically beautiful, did not positively influence the survival rate of this challenge. Not only were they fast, they hit like Will Smith's wife's alopecia.
Keep fucking my pipes now!
I'm going to.
Were absolute bullet sponges and were placed in very awkward spots throughout the hospital. However, whilst we faced up to our first hunter, the words of a wise man rang out in our minds.
Get the fuck out of my sight before I demolish you.
I was being the aggressor here, so instead, I'd need to become socially awkward. Just like that overly aggressive crackhead in town who was always asking for money, if we look straight up to the sky to avoid eye contact, the hunter just sits there in stunned silence. You can almost just imagine its little reptilian brain going, oh fuck, my one weakness. He's looking up at the ceiling. Whilst like the crackhead in town, you could be assaulted once in a while, this tactic does help us to make it past the first hunter as well as the one guarding the adjoining hallway. There is, however, an outlier. This shit. Within the palliative care ward, there are 2 hunters who are apparently euthanizing all of the patients in here, and at the end of the ward is a cassette that we'd use to play a copy of Dr. Virgil's workplace abuse into the biometric lock to gain access to his office.
They now elect a chairman.
No, they can't because the vice chair's here. I take charge. Read the standing orders. Read them and understand them.
The problem is, trying to get through this door whilst looking directly up to Jesus does not provide the kind of satisfactory results we've been hoping for. Whilst replaying the rest of this brain rot again, I had time to contemplate what strategy we could possibly use here. In no way did I have enough ammo to beat these 2, nor did I have the health to tank my way through it. Our best and probably only option was to flash these 2 and pray to RNGesus that we could make the return trip in time. There were problems though. Problem 1 was that when flashing the hunters, they swiped wildly around as the grenade burned out their retinas, which exacerbated this situation as pre-flashing the room blocks one of the hunters in the door, meaning we can't get past. Problem 2 was that these green anal swabs often jumped over and around the beds, which if they do whilst I flashed, they wouldn't get stunned. 2 painstaking resets later, through process of elimination, the best option was that we'd need to enter the ward looking up to gain some ground inside the room before flashing. That way, the hunters aren't blocking the door and enough time has passed that both have definitely finished doing their gymnastics off the bed. With the cassette retrieved, the first stun would now be wearing off, so we'd send another flash up into the sky for our return trip, and despite 2 flashbangs and a first aid spray making this a very costly trip, it was simply the price of doing walking business. With access to Dr. Virgil's laboratory secured, we find him the opposite of alive, and despite having to read continual Nikolai hate mail, Virgil had luckily stashed a fresh, ice-cold sample of the vaccine in the storage unit next door. We need to get this to Jill as quickly as possible, turning around to immediately issue a well-placed knuckle sandwich into the chops of the hunter who drops from this ceiling. After heading next door, we turn our neck 90 degrees upwards to stop giving this lizard the attention he so desperately craved, and with a few scratches, we make it back to the penultimate room, walking past the liquor and successfully administering the vaccine to Jill. With Jill's snot and violently high temperature now subsiding, it was just a matter of time until she fully recovered, but it was time we didn't have. Our wait for the vaccine to work is interrupted by Tyrell, who bursts in to pass the time by watching his favourite Twitch streamer.
Stop, they have no...
Bomb has been located.
Jinxie's rage was like a mating call, attracting another horde of zombies to our location, and thus, the fight for the hospital begins. Feeling like an employee on Black Friday, we began stemming back the overwhelming crowd trying to purchase a TV for the same price it's always been. Yeah! The onslaught is pretty intense, and despite thinking I was on top of the zombie guest list into the hospital, at times I still found myself being overrun. But thanks largely to the AR's double mag that we'd found in the safe upstairs and a grenade I'd saved from earlier, we can clutch onto the progress we'd made by our fingertips, barely dispatching the 2 hunters that charge in here. Before long, the only option we had to stem the unrelenting horde was to bomb the hospital that we were all inside. With the ghouls held at bay, Tyrell reveals that the government was offering to call off the nukes if a sample of the vaccine could be retrieved. With the lives of everyone here, and the world in Carlos's hands, he headed down into the lab beneath the city in search of more of the pink juice. Once the vaccine had begun to work, Jill felt life returning to her. Right at the start of this section, there was a huge choice to make. We currently had only 42 minutes remaining before S-rank expiry, a very scary amount of time. It felt like it fell exactly in the range of possible failure or possible success. Now, with that in mind, we could head straight down into the lab in search of the finish line, but one look at our ammo store showed that we were rocking the Oliver Twist inventory. Back in the hospital, though, there are a number of locked cabinets or areas that contained ammunition that we could collect. Now, some of them aren't viable as we'd make a net loss on the ammo we'd have to use to get them. So to ensure we balanced ammunition gathering with time saving, I identified these 4 ammo caches inside the hospital that would keep us relatively safe whilst providing a good amount of resources in return. First up, we find a gunpowder B in Bard's office. Dodging past this hunter, we then try to get access to these 4 magnum rounds in this locker, but what I hadn't accounted for was that one of Carlos's hunters had escaped out of their ward. After dodging around the hunters up here, the third cache was 2 more magnum rounds in this box, and finally 4 more in the locked container here at the start. Overall, minus a little loss of health, we'd made a nice addition to our ammo stores. With ammo shopping completed, we could now begin our journey into the lab that had spawned the forced evolutionary virus and are presented with yet another critical decision. I'm starting to get decision fatigue over here. As it stood, our last save had been made just before the clock tower fight, meaning a large amount of progress was again at risk. One save was already reserved for later, meaning we only had 1 save left. With all the factors and fights to come in the lab, the decision came down to saving now, or banking the save and using it just before the waste disposal fight. I rolled the dice of destiny and decided to place my progress in the hands of my obviously flawed and fluctuating skill levels, praying that I could make it through the lab without perishing. Whether this was the right choice or not will remain to be seen, but we kickstart the lab segment by shorting the entire warehouse's power supply, requiring us to collect and replace all 3 of these fuses to get the lift up and running again. We have an immensely concerning moment trying to dodge past one of the hunter gammas, but spamming the dodge button gets us through to gather up fuse 2, and we head up the ladder to find fuse 3. We clear out the adjoining room to the final fuse where we dodge underneath the incoming hunter, and on the return trip somehow make it past the palehead guarding the way back. With more subsequent dodges and rapid fuse placement, we can make it up to the control tower. An email from Nikolai shows that he was in fact an Institute agent, sent in undercover to infiltrate the lab, game end Dr. Virgil, and destroy all remnants of the vaccine to help cover their tracks. He had to be stopped. Not least of all, because he's a weirdo. And with the help of the Magnum's extended barrel giving us some additional firepower, we headed into the lab's testing area, the home of the virus. A quick stop for an inventory reorg ensures that we have everything we need for the pre-endgame, including freshly crafted Magnum rounds that help to one-shot the Paleheads stumbling around the lab looking for vitamin D. We grab the USB dongle pre-installed with opendoor.exe to gain access to this lovely room of vacuum-sealed flesh. We take care of these moderately irritating enemies as quickly as possible, and upstairs we can grab the first of 2 base chemicals required for synthesis of the vaccine. With some more enemies laid out and some additional resources acquired, we power the main doors back on and find a whole room of failed super mutants. I guess technically the unofficial siblings of our Nemesis. The upper lab housed the second chemical we needed to create the vaccine, but between us and it we had a large amount of enemies, all of whom were contenders for Dickhead of the Year. With one Palehead slumbered, thinking a grenade round would clear the doorway for us was apparently naive of me. Our grenade launcher round apparently rolls a -1 on its effect range, with its explosive radius seemingly vanishing off into the void. Failing to take into account this or the zombies' resistance to explosives, we miss our dodge on the second lunge attack by mere milliseconds, and we were now in a state of panic. As this parasite tried to suck me up their weird little hole like I was a glass jar, this grab did have a silver lining. The moments in between me having my forehead sucked like I was a teat had allowed the other 2 enemies to move slightly closer, as well as giving me a few vital seconds to heal and act whilst they waited for us to finish the grab animation. Another grenade round and a mine dart gives us the space we needed to grab the second compound before we secure our exit out of the lab via kneecapping the other 2 parasites who'd been waiting outside for more bitty. Down on the way out, the hunters in stasis erupt out to see what all the noise was about, but the acid rounds that we'd picked up earlier were super effective at softening the hunters' hard exterior. A bit like therapy, except more violent, and before long we'd put the 5 of them back into a permanent state of inactivity. With both compounds now in hand, we walked our way back upstairs to the vaccine air fryer and placed both chemicals inside to start synthesizing our Get Out of Nuclear Holocaust free card. All we needed to do now was to get out of here in one piece. But Nemesis, being the massive hulking hemorrhoid that he was not having it. Its goal was no longer just to end us. It had gained sentient consciousness and had overwritten the Institute's primary programming. Its primary objective was to now preserve this virus-infested world that it had helped to create by stopping the vaccine from getting out of Raccoon City. But one intense cutscene and an explosion later, and we'd escaped its clutches and arrived at the 4th save of the run. Now, the reason I'd chosen to save here and not before starting the lab was that Nest was predictable. I knew where every enemy was, more or less, and apart from the very odd occasion where random weird shit would happen, we were in control of our destiny here. In the waste disposal fight, however, not only were there opportunities for us to be instantly fisted, but the periodic release of more enemies into the arena, compiled with the erratic behaviour of our Nemesis, introduced an element of variance that was impossible to predict. So, with the 4th save being made here, the hope was that it would help to save potential hours of having to repeat the lab. With the ink barely dry on the typewriter, we spend a few minutes compiling our inventory, and with a nice amount of gunpowder stockpiled, our range of ammo crafting possibilities were looking healthy. But on the way down to the arena, we slip and drop the vaccine, which was the cue for Nikolai to magically teleport himself in front of us like some pantomime villain. Picking it up, he states that he planned to inform the Institute of the vaccine's destruction, before slipping it up inside his rectum and smuggling it out of Raccoon City to sell to the highest bidder. Before we could do anything, we were thrown down into the arena to begin our penultimate fight with Nemesis, where the reason for banking our 4th save of the run for here is evidenced almost immediately. Luckily, instead of being 25 minutes away, we were 2 seconds away, and wrapping up the first phase before Carlos arrives isn't difficult at all. The grenade launcher comes in clutch and the Magnum issues out plenty of damage to rapidly trigger phase 2. But this new phase introduced the periodic drops of zombies and paleheads into the arena that we talked about, which in some cases were distracting and in others a complete death sentence. Immediately hitting Nemesis with a flame round sends him up to sit behind Tank 6, which with him stunned allows us to dish out some free damage whilst also keeping an eye on the approaching zombies. After we hit him off Tank 8, we get as much fire and Magnum damage in as we can before setting up Carlos, who should come in with a crane assist. But we unbelievably missed the shot on Tank 3, watching on as the additional influx of damage is lost to the ether. Whilst I could have reset here, I decided to push through, meaning it was now all on us. The flame rounds were great at providing damage over time, the Magnum at instantly stopping the paleheads in their tracks, and Nemesis for helping to completely blow the backs out of the regular zombies. but time and ammunition were quickly running out. Nemesis jumps up to Tank 8, and with us staring down the barrel of an all-you-can-eat palehead buffet, Carlos comes in to conduct dental surgery just in time, helping to deliver the final blow. With Nemesis being dissolved and flushed away like a massive log stuck in the U-bend, we had now reached our final save. Save 5 was always destined to be at this point, and anybody who's attempted Inferno will understand why. Nemesis still refused to die and had now taken on the form of a massive second-hand fleshlight, with his new medical-grade silicone exterior being completely impenetrable. No conventional weaponry that we possessed could defeat him. That is, apart from the conveniently placed railgun right next to us. In order for us to gain access to the end credit sequence, we'd have to hit Nemesis with this thing twice. We get a free railgun shot on the house at the beginning, but it completely drained the AA batteries it was connected up to, meaning they'd need to be recharged before we could fire the final shot. In order for us to do this, we'd need to stun Nemesis by shooting all 8 of the glowing genital herpes that had sprung up over its body. Once the final one was destroyed, Nemesis would fall to the ground long enough for us to push them in without being grabbed. But if only it was as easy as that. The fight's difficulty scaling basically came down to just how much of a raging alcoholic Nemesis could be here. The attacks are outrageous, the reaction times required to hit these are insane, and while speedrunners would only need to spend 2 cycles in this absolute shithole, because we could only walk, we would need to spend 3 cycles in here. About 7 deaths deep, I've been able to index its movesets, all of which, by the way, were insta-kills and had individual timings required to hit the perfect dodge, meaning the room for error was -1. The first move is the Dickhead Slam, which is the worst out of the lot. There's a varying amount of slams that end with a paused one to throw us off our rhythm. If Margaret Thatcher was a moveset, it would be this.
And we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago.
But you could tell it apart from the alternating hand slam, which always starts with the left hand, moving to the right and finishing with the left. We then have the side sweep, the forward sweep, the massive overhead smash, and the scream at service workers because they forgot my mozzarella dippers attack, which stuns us in place and is followed up with the alternating hand slam. If we wanted to survive this, we would need to hit perfect timing on every single attack that came our way throughout each of these 3 cycles. Reloading at the wrong moment or receiving the projectile urine Nemesis was excreting directly into our eyes would, as you guessed it, result in death. But doing gaming challenges are a lifestyle choice, and despite this particular lifestyle choice feeling like I had polio, we had the minerals to do this. We funneled all of our skill points from strength into agility, and with a license to now thrill, we waited patiently for the first attack. Dodging through this, we take out our opening 3 ball sacks before we're hit with the raw attack. We fight for our lives to get out of the stun animation before dodging all 3 of the follow-up attacks. We destroy 3 more spots but hold our fire on the last one. Leaving the last spot like this was a critical moment in the fight. One of the battery cells was right at the back of the arena, way too far for someone walking to reach it in time if we downed Nemesis here. With 2 magnum rounds left over from our last fight with Nemesis, if we walk straight towards the cell before destroying the remaining pustule at the last possible second, Nemesis is stunned, with us only being a few steps away from the battery, giving us the additional precious seconds we'd need to get out of there alive. With the most dangerous of the 3 batteries now complete, business was resumed. Bullets rained down on Nemesis and its weak points as he refused to give up in his attempts to flatten us into a Jill sandwich. But our dodges were perfect every single time. With Nemesis stunned for a second time, we get an opening to push battery 2 in, and we were now 1 battery away from victory. Focus was the key here. I hadn't blinked in so long my eyes had started to water. This unwavering concentration on Nemesis had elevated me to a new level of gaming athleticism. This was peak gaming performance. I'd become Neo fighting Agent Smith at the end of The Matrix. I could see everything Nemesis was going to do before he even did it. Heart rates were reaching maximum capacity. With 1 glowing spot left, we pull the Magnum out, and within a frame of victory, we brace ourselves to dodge the final attack.
You want stars? I'll give you stars!
I have never felt more satisfaction than pressing mouse 1 here. It felt like a good stretch, that first sip of water in the morning and the purest crack imaginable, all wrapped up into one. But I'd almost forgotten that this wasn't the reason we were here. what was the time? It felt like we'd been in this boss fight for days, maybe months. As we walked as fast as we possibly could towards the elevator and the end of the game, all sorts of scenarios were going through my head. Had we done enough? Was this to be all in vain? And would we really have to try and pull the vaccine out of Nikolai's arsehole? Well, we get one answer at least, as whilst Nikolai was fighting Carlos, the vaccine flies out of his butt and hits Jill in the face, smashing on the floor next to us. Thanks to Nikolai's weaponized flatulence, with no sample of the vaccine, the government refuses to hold up their end of the bargain, and as we escape the city, we pass the nukes mid-flight. As we waited for the results screen, what little hope we had left had begun to fade. All the pain that we'd suffered for in this run, had it been for nothing? Not only had we walked our way out of Raccoon City with the coveted S rank, but the vaccine had been with us the entire time, coursing through Jill's veins. The cure to the forced evolutionary virus rested in Jill's blood. So we had in fact won on both counts, adding our first walking S rank victory to the series. Thank you so much for watching and for all the support you guys give on all these videos. Let me know in the comments if there's any challenges or games you'd like to see next, and I'll see you in the next episode of How Far We Can Push the Limits of Gaming Suffering.